A racist co-pilot refuses to fly with female captain, then karma strikes mid-flight. You've probably heard of people who let their biases control their actions, but nothing could prepare you for what happened on this flight. The story begins on a routine day at the airport. A plane, ready for takeoff, with a flight crew just doing their jobs. But what happens next will make you question the idea of fairness and justice in a whole new way. Her name was Captain Elise Taylor, and she was about to lead her team on a flight that would change everything. She was strong, determined, and had spent years working to earn her place as one of the best pilots in the business. She wasn't the first female captain at the airline, but she was one of the few. And she had worked harder than anyone else to prove herself. But not everyone shared the same respect for her position. Enter First Officer Mark Stanton, a man who believed that women had no place in the cockpit. It wasn't something he said outright, but his actions spoke louder than words. From the moment Captain Taylor was assigned to the flight, Mark made his disdain for her clear. He didn't say much to her, but it was obvious in the way he looked at her, in the way he refused to engage with her during pre-flight briefings. He didn't like the idea of a woman being in charge of the aircraft. Elise, on the other hand, remained professional. She had faced discrimination before. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her because of her gender. But this wasn't about her proving herself to him. It was about doing her job, keeping the passengers safe, and making sure the flight went smoothly. That was her focus. What happened next, though, was unexpected. As the final preparations were being made for takeoff, Mark approached the crew, his face tense. He made a shocking announcement that no one saw coming. "I'm not flying with her," he said, his voice sharp and cold. The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room stopped. Elise looked up at him, trying to process what he had just said. The other crew members were silent, unsure of how to react. Everyone could feel the tension, but no one was brave enough to speak up. "I'm not flying with a woman," Mark continued, his voice growing more agitated. "I'm not comfortable with it." Elise stood there, stunned. She had been through a lot in her career, had faced challenges, fought hard for her position, and earned every ounce of respect she had. But this was different. It was personal. The airline had clear policies about professionalism and respect. And yet, here she was, being told by a colleague that he wouldn't work with her because of her gender. The anger inside her was palpable. But she knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't let him see how much his words had hurt her. The tension in the air was thick, and the rest of the crew didn't know how to respond. But then, something surprising happened. The flight manager, who had been standing nearby, stepped in. "Elise is your captain today, Mark. You'll either fly with her, or you won't fly at all. The choice is yours." For a moment, Mark hesitated. His face reddened, and it seemed like he was about to say something more. But instead, he stormed off, muttering under his breath. The crew quickly scrambled to get things in order. They couldn't afford to delay the flight, but this wasn't over. Mark had made it clear he didn't want to be part of this flight. And now, as Elise sat in the cockpit, preparing for takeoff, she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The disrespect was still lingering, and the worst part? She knew that the passengers, people she was supposed to be protecting, might have no idea what had just transpired. They might never know the battle she had fought behind the scenes just to get in the cockpit. Elise took a deep breath. This was about her job, her responsibilities, and the trust that her passengers had placed in her. It wasn't about Mark. She wasn't going to let him ruin her flight, but little did she know, karma was already on its way. As the plane ascended into the sky, Captain Elise Taylor focused on the instruments in front of her. Her hands were steady on the controls, her mind sharp, as she kept the aircraft on course. But despite her professionalism, her thoughts kept drifting back to what had just happened with Mark. She had always prided herself on her ability to rise above the petty challenges she faced in her career. But this wasn't just petty. It was personal. It was a blatant display of disrespect, and it stung in a way she hadn't expected. Mark, however, seemed to be doing everything in his power to make her job harder. From the moment the plane took off, he barely spoke to her. Instead, he sat with his arms crossed, looking out the window as if he was a passenger rather than a co-pilot. Elise knew this wasn't just awkwardness. It was his refusal to work with her, his way of making it clear that he didn't think she belonged in that seat. For the first few hours of the flight, things were relatively calm. Elise continued to follow the flight plan, making sure everything was in order. But the tension in the cockpit was unbearable. Mark's silence felt like a heavy weight, pressing down on her. And just when she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the unexpected happened. Without warning, the aircraft began to experience turbulence. The plane jolted and shook, causing some of the passengers in the cabin to gasp. Elise's heart raced for a moment, but her training kicked in. She focused on maintaining control, adjusting the aircraft's speed and altitude to stabilize the flight. She knew this was a common occurrence, but she couldn't help but notice that Mark, the very person who had refused to fly with her, was doing nothing to assist. Mark sat frozen in his seat, staring at the controls, but not making any attempt to help. The turbulence grew worse. The plane rocked more violently, and a feeling of unease spread throughout the cabin. Elise knew this was the moment she had to step up, but as she reached for the controls to stabilize the plane, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. Mark wasn't just sitting there. He had his hands off the controls. In that moment, the reality hit her. He wasn't just refusing to work with her, he was actively undermining her. And if things didn't improve soon, they were in real trouble. Elise quickly took action, her mind racing. She adjusted the plane's altitude, trying to get out of the rough air. The turbulence was strong, and the passengers were beginning to get anxious. Elise was doing everything she could to keep them safe, but there was only so much she could do alone. She needed Mark's help. "Mark!" Elise called out, her voice firm and steady despite the chaos around her. "I need you to engage and assist with the controls." For a split second, Mark hesitated. Then, as if reluctantly, he reached over and grabbed the controls. But it was clear to Elise that he wasn't doing it out of cooperation. He was doing it out of necessity. He was still angry, still bitter, but now he had no choice but to follow her lead. Elise took a deep breath and continued to guide the plane through the turbulence. But she knew the moment Mark let go of the controls, they would be in danger. She couldn't trust him. Not anymore. And then, as if the universe was reminding them of the importance of teamwork, things took a turn for the worse. The plane's engine began to sputter. A warning light flashed on the control panel, signaling a potential mechanical failure. Elise's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't something you could ignore, not at 30,000 feet. She quickly radioed in, alerting air traffic control to the issue. She had to remain calm, her passengers, her crew, her safety. All of it depended on her ability to think clearly in a crisis. Mark, still seething with anger, said nothing. He was hardly engaged in the situation. But in that moment, Elise realized that her skill, her calm, and her experience were all that stood between everyone on that plane and disaster. The years of hard work, the fights she had fought to get here, all came down to this moment. Despite Mark's resistance, Elise took charge. She handled the emergency, fixed the issue with the help of air traffic control, and safely navigated the plane back on course. She knew that if she had let the situation escalate, if she had allowed herself to be distracted by Mark's refusal to cooperate, things could have gone terribly wrong. As the turbulence finally settled and the flight continued smoothly, Elise allowed herself a quiet moment of relief. The passengers were unaware of the dangers they had just faced. They were relaxing in their seats, some chatting, others reading. But for Elise, the weight of the experience hung heavy. When the plane touched down safely and the passengers began disembarking, Elise was exhausted, but she was also proud, not just of her skills but of her strength. She had taken control when it mattered most. But Mark's behavior didn't go unnoticed. As soon as the flight landed, Captain Elise Taylor filed a formal report, detailing everything that had happened on the flight, from Mark's refusal to work with her, to his negligence during the turbulence, and his complete lack of support during the mechanical failure. It wasn't about getting revenge. It was about standing up for herself, standing up for the dignity of her profession. She had earned her place in that cockpit, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. The airline took the matter seriously. An investigation was launched, and it didn't take long for the truth to come out. Mark's actions weren't just unprofessional, they were dangerous. The airline made a public statement, condemning his behavior, and within days, Mark was suspended pending further review. Karma had struck. In the end, Captain Elise Taylor wasn't just a survivor of a difficult flight. She was a symbol of strength and resilience. She didn't just prove that she belonged in the cockpit. She proved that respect, integrity, and teamwork were more powerful than any prejudice or hate. And as for Mark, he learned the hard way that karma doesn't forget. And sometimes, the universe has a way of ensuring that justice is served. The moral of the story? No one should ever have to prove their worth to anyone. Your worth is yours, and it will shine through, no matter the obstacles. But sometimes, standing up for yourself and doing what's right makes all the difference. Elise's strength saved not only her career, but also the lives of everyone aboard that flight. Next time you encounter disrespect or hate, remember her story. Because standing tall is the only way to truly soar.